Hey guys, Ryan here, and this is my first devlog for my game, 5th Cataclysm, demo available now on itch.io and Steam page, pending approval as of the time of recording. As a little background, since this is the first devlog I'm making, roughly a year and a half into development, so, better late than never. 5th Cataclysm is a dungeon crawler, deck builder, kind of JRPG hybrid. The main gameplay loop is to explore a handcrafted dungeon and find loot. The twist is that all loot is cards, which are added to your deck. So your deck is effectively your inventory. Some loot is effective in combat, and you want to use it to kill things, but others are a lot more useful to sell off in the shop. Of course, that means that as you explore, you end up acquiring more ineffective cards which dilute your deck. Cards also have a durability and will degrade with each use, which will also decrease its sell value. So the tension here is like, I have these valuable cards which are diluting my deck in combat. At some point I need to return to town and sell them off to purchase, more effective cards, but I also want to keep exploring. So I've just recently released the demo publicly on itch, link in description, and I was playtesting it at a game dev group event, shout out Potions and Pixels in Charlotte, and I found that my intro was really just not hooking players. It wasn't even tutorializing the game, so it was really doing, I would say, 0% of what a good intro to a game should do. So having identified this problem, I was trying to look for solutions. I was finding that there was just a lot of text front loading for exposition and tutorialization, and with just the amount that there was being delivered to the player, people were just either not reading it or full on just being completely checked out and wanting to leave the playtest. So really, like, worst of all possible worlds. So for my first major patch since the public release of the demo, I wanted to focus on improving this first time user experience, because it really doesn't matter how good the rest of the game is if people are going to stop playing after 2 minutes, because you're just not really effectively hooking them. So I ripped out the introductory cutscene. I'm definitely going to put it in later somewhere else that is delivered to you after you've had an opportunity to kind of come to grips with the game systems and hopefully find a sort of like systemic hook keeping you in there. And I kept a very short, kind of generic JRPG intro of, you wake up, It works for all the Pokemon games, so I figure it can work for me. And that's just delivered through a really short text blurb that's like, you wake up. Take on the world, do your shit. Next, I made the very first thing you do is use a combat card to initiate combat. So what that means is, in my system, I kind of take a hint from the SMT series, where you can initiate a combat by seeing an enemy on the overworld and attacking them with something. The twist here with my game is that you have a deck of cards, and each of those cards have some sort of functionality while you're in this overworld state, so really any time outside of combat. And usually what this means is, if you initiate it, there's some sort of hitbox that appears when you play the card. And if you strike an enemy, or in some cases, the enemy just touches you while this card is active, it will automatically play the card. It will not cost an action point. It will still take a use off of the card's durability, but it's going to do that whether you play it like this or not. But this is a really important mechanic for players to understand, because it's the way that you get advantage in battle. And since this is a game where you're constantly losing resources and having to manage those effectively to be able to explore, not understanding how to start a combat encounter in advantage is bad. And it's an important thing, I think, to teach as soon as possible to mitigate any sort of player frustration from, all of my cards are degrading, I'm having trouble in combat. I want people to feel pretty effective right off the bat. So this also has a really beneficial side effect of the player getting into combat within the first 1 to 2 minutes of the game. Previously, before this patch 1.1.0, players could easily go several minutes before they reach their first real combat encounter, and I really think the strength of my game is the combat. So you know, it's not a good idea to try to hook people with the parts of your game that aren't as strong. Go figure. In fact, there was a lot of wasted space, really. There's an entire zone that you'll be able to see in the video where there's just really not a lot there previously. Now there's combat encounters, but previously it was just a lot of empty space that people would wander around in kind of semi-aimlessly. And again, that doesn't really create a very engaging hook. I think it's really important for players to have a really clear goal, especially when they're starting out, or else they just feel lost, frustrated. Especially when I'm like administering playtests, I find myself having to kind of direct people, which I know is not a great way to conduct playtests, but we're doing it pretty informally. So yeah, I think that the new way is going to be a huge improvement. You know, at least when you're starting from such a low point, most things will improve it. So the big benefit of having this starting area have combat in it, and you have to do combat in order to progress, is that it familiarizes the player obviously with the combat, but also gaining cards as loot, which is another unique mechanic in our game that is, you know, probably you're not going to come into it with a lot of knowledge from previous games. So it's definitely something that takes a little bit more onboarding to teach. So the enemies are all slimes. So in this starting area, you only have to deal with one enemy type, and they will all drop the slime card or the manhole cover card, an offensive and defensive card respectively. And in order to progress to the town, which is found by simply following the road that you are placed on as soon as you leave your house, you will find an NPC that blocks your path and requires you to show that you have 3 slime cards in your deck in order to pass. So now, in order to even get to the town, you have to at least do 3 combats, because slimes are guaranteed to drop a card. They might drop the manhole cover card, which you don't need, but they're more likely to drop the slime card. So you're 3 to 4, 5 if you're very unlucky combats to be able to progress. So now I can at least show that the player has some proficiency in combat and in, at the very least, clicking on the cards to add them to their deck. And I guess I'm kind of relying on the player to kind of intuit what's happening at that point. But now the player's able to, they have some cards in their deck, they've done some combat, now they're able to proceed to the town. In addition to being able to proceed to the town, they are given $20 for their great civic duty in culling the slime population of this little neighborhood. So now the player has some money. This is where the store is. In the previous versions, the player would not have had any combats up until this point. So I was noticing in playtests, players would, you know, they'd want to kind of explore, walk around, see what's up. They'd go into the shop and they wouldn't have any money. They wouldn't be able to buy anything. And it just feels bad. Oftentimes in a lot of my reference games, like JRPGs in general, players usually start with enough money to buy like one piece of equipment and some consumables. And so I felt like it was important for people that, you know, want to go off the path that is, like, I guess, quote unquote intended, that they should feel rewarded for doing so and feel like, oh wow, I can, you know, buy these things, I can browse the shop, and that's great, that's Gucci. So now they have the ability to do that. But if they just proceed south towards the dungeon, there's yet another NPC gating their path, and it requires the player to go buy a basic healing item from the shop. And so at this point, now I can guarantee that the player has some proficiency in at least knowing where the shop is and how to purchase a card, because the only way to get this card is to purchase it from the shop. It is relatively inexpensive. So even if the player went to the shop first before meeting this NPC and they spent all of their money, they can simply go back to the neighborhood, and it should take about 3 combat encounters if you went all the way down to $0 to have enough money to purchase this healing card. So at this point, I kind of set them loose into the dungeon. The NPC that was gating them also gives them additional cards just to get them started. And that's really what my first big patch post demo release was focused on. So if you've watched this much, thank you very much. Links in the description. Definitely please give the game a shot. It is available on browser, on Windows, Linux, and Android. Although for the Android version, I highly recommend using a gamepad of some sort because I don't have native touch controls for all of the game yet. Thanks.